Welcome to the Near Memo, a weekly conversation about search, social, and commerce. What happened, why it matters, and the implications for local. Welcome to episode 70, amazingly, of the Near Memo with David, Mike, and me, where we talk about search, social, and commerce through a local lens. And today's a kind of special all search edition. We talk about search a lot, but this is going to focus primarily on Google and a cluster of kind of related issues. And first up is David to talk about a pretty interesting piece that appeared this week in The Atlantic by Charlie Warzel, who was a former New York Times writer, and he bailed, I think, for Substack. And now he's a partial New York Times columnist, or not, excuse me. He writes periodically for the Atlantic. Yes, correct. Thanks. Yep. And so why don't you lead us off with that, David? So what?
Sure.
About that?
Yeah, it's a very interesting article, very sort of classic Atlantic, well-researched, pretty long, held my interest certainly most of the way through it. He spoke with names that will be very familiar to most of our podcast listeners, I'm sure. Marie Haynes and Danny Sullivan and Rand Fishkin as his three primary sources. The gist of the article was that he proposes at least that Google's search results are getting noticeably worse, and that this is a trend that's been going on for quite a long time. And that one of the reasons they're getting worse is that they're chock full of what he calls SEO chum, and that they're very boring, that the results that get returned are also sort of very authoritative, heavy brand focus, very dry results. And he sort of laments the lack of this sort of natural human curiosity, I would say, in discovering new things that was a part of the early internet. So that was, I don't know if you agree with that characterization of the piece, but that's sort of the arc of the piece as I read it. I would argue that there's a couple of things there that stood out to me. First of all, he specifically talks about a couple of guys that he sort of hardcore internet users that he was speaking with that have figured out this hack to get better results on Google, which is to append the word Reddit to the end of each of their searches, which was pretty funny. I thought, just as an aside, but sure enough, the Google Trends data, I went and looked to see if he was actually telling the truth. The searches for Reddit are just on a very steady increase from the moment of Reddit's existence. So whether or not that's as a result of the hack or Reddit building a better brand remains to be discovered, but sort of an interesting comment. But that, to me, also spoke to the people that are sort of in Charlie Warzel's orbit, which are very online internet users. And I think that those are probably the people that are lamenting this decline in Google search result quality and loss of being able to discover new sources and these kinds of things. I don't know that we would feel the same, that the general public, if Pew did a survey, would necessarily come up with the same reactions. Now, the pieces that he specifically highlights, especially after talking with Rand, in terms of the degradation of results, have largely to do with way more ads and way more Google properties at the top of commercial queries. And that's, I didn't think a distinction, a nuance that he explored fully enough is the informational queries maybe still actually return some of these longer tail, more interesting result types that he would like to see. But the commercial queries are the ones that have been cannibalized by Google, whether through ads or through their own properties. And so I think that that's maybe is sort of what's causing the angst and was the genesis of this article, was this sort of the commercial aspect or the results that get returned for commercial queries. But anyway, I'll pause there.
Can I add an anecdote here? The other day, I think it was just 2 days ago, my wife came to me and said, Google result, and she is not a sophisticated searcher. She spends a lot of time online and searches a lot. Her default search engine is DuckDuckGo, but she goes back to Google regularly. And she said, Google search results suck more and more lately. And that every time I do a search for something that I'm looking for, like nonviolence, I am constantly confronted with commercial results. And Google should be forced to ask me whether I want commercial or non-commercial results. So two things here. One is my wife noticed this and commented on it. And two,
But
it's
she's
as
married
much
to you,
about
Mike.
true, but we don't always see eye to eye on technology things. And two, it is as much the perception as reality in terms of what it affecting Google's opportunities in the future. And if enough people think that, and there are viable currently fragmented alternatives, but one of those may ultimately take off and change that reality. So
That's right. And
I
Danny Sullivan, to his credit, who I've not agreed with on many things, maybe even most things, since he moved over to the Google side of the house, he did admit that that is a serious existential threat. Whether or not it's true that results have degraded, that the perception that they've degraded actually does represent a threat to Google. So,
yes,
I think this is an interesting question that you raise, both of you raised, about how widespread is this perception. I mean, we talked about it earlier when for this. Is this in fact a common perception, or is this just a perception of a small number of, ultra sophisticated internet veterans who are lamenting the uniformity or corporatization of search results, or however we want to describe it? And I think there is something more than just a subset of insiders who feel this way, and Mike's anecdotal example is a kind of illustration of that. Now, what we can attribute it to, which is ultimately kind of what I saw the article trying to answer, is like there's this perception that Google results are getting worse. Why is that? What's going on with that? And I think, as the article illustrated, there's no single answer. I certainly share that perception. Ads have a lot to do with it, and then also there may be sort of less long tail content in some situations, but it's very, very hard to diagnose exactly what's going on. I think there is a kind of emerging perception of degradation in quality. How widespread is a question mark. I don't think the ordinary users will talk about privacy and other issues. I don't think they're going to say search quality has degraded necessarily, but I think that that's the direction things are going, certainly. And I do think there is, as I've said before in other contexts, I do think there's an appetite for alternatives that exist. Although we have to say that DuckDuckGo's search query volume has declined. It was above. Barry Schwartz wrote about this. It was above a certain threshold. I don't remember what that daily threshold was, and it's
100 million,
yeah, something like that. And it has gone down recently, not by a huge amount, but somewhat. So, excuse me, sorry, I had to cough. So something is, having said that, there's an appetite for alternatives, and DuckDuckGo is kind of the most viable one among a group. That's an interesting kind of juxtaposition.
Although I read that Brave's search engine volume is way up. I don't know the numbers or how they compare to DuckDuckGo, and they just released
that makes sense because those audiences have got to be a pretty tight
same
Venn diagram.
Yeah, they're the same. So maybe if Brave is gaining, it's at DuckDuckGo's expense. At any rate,
one quick thing I wanted to say is just that I found the article again. I thought it was a very good article, which is why we're talking about it. It's interesting, worth my time to read. I found it to have this sort of incoherent conclusion in terms of what Charlie wants Google to do about this. Because on the one hand, he laments the SEO Chum 10 best listicles, which he highlights a funny example from the Hoth, a content marketing agency. So he laments the sort of poor quality of results that Google's returning. And he also doesn't want these sort of boring corporate brand results getting returned either. And as we know, Eric Schmidt's famous dictum that brands are how you sort out the cesspool of the internet. I think those are the two levers that Google has to pull. You can either show more brands, which are going to be too boring for Charlie, or we can show more sort of, perfectly optimized on-page stuff that he also laments from the Hoth. And so I don't know that there's a middle ground of results.
I think there is.
That
I think
Google
there
can
is.
return.
I think there is a middle ground. I don't know what percentage of results it constitutes. I think there are sort of people who are sort of experts and people who are writing for because they have knowledge or interest in topics that are out there. It may be a thin slice of the overall content pie. but I think it does exist. It just maybe those pages are not well optimized, and so they're losing out to the listicles. I do think on that point, the SEO chum point, which is a little unfair. I do think that there's just an explosion of content that's created for SEO purposes, and you see advice routinely like every blog post should exceed 1,000 words or 2,000 words, and there's a kind of formulaic approach to everything. And I experienced that within Uberall. There were people that were sort of advising, this is how you write a blog post. It looks like this, and it has these components, and so on and so forth. And to some degree, that's true, but I instinctively recoil at that kind of thing. But that's widespread. It's very, very widespread.
Marie Haynes rightly points out that some of Google's latest advances, like BERT and MUM, are designed to reward content about a topic that a user is interested in, even if that wasn't an exact match to their search query. But I'm skeptical that people who write for writing's sake are actually, even if they are experts, they may not be writing in a way that the internet wants to consume, right? And so I think it's going to be very hard for Google to reward those kinds of experts with high search results, because by every measurable data point, that's going to be a bad experience. If somebody lands on a page, doesn't get what they're looking for, clicks back to Google, they're not writing in many cases, not all cases, but in many cases, the true experts are not writing in a way that's geared for internet consumption.
Yeah, I think that that's completely accurate, and they may have bad websites that are slow to load and things like that. Go ahead, Mike.
I think that there's a conflation in this conversation between Google's ever increasing ad surface and commercialization. That's on the one side, and the other is the actual content it's delivered around.
Agreed. Yep.
Right. And I think that those are two separate issues within Google, driven by two separate sort of demands of the organization. And we have seen this incredible march of ads into every ambiguous search you can imagine. And some of it is the increased use of AdWords, but some of it's just Google's willingness to cover virtually every surface with an ad. And I think that makes it very difficult to separate these two questions, which I think are both relevant questions and but deserve separate answers.
Danny defended that 80% of Google search results don't show or haven't shown ads over the past X number of years.
Well, that's an empirical question that somebody could test out with a substantial enough keyword set. But we don't have that.
We could look at the 1,000 top keywords and see what ads show up for those various.
Well, I
think that would be.
Go ahead, David.
That would be a way to test, though, Mike, is to say, okay, here's a subset of keywords that we're going to extract Google Ads and Google self-preference properties from. Are these results better or worse? And show that to a set of 1,000 users and figure that data point out.
Two final points. One is, as we saw from the 1,000 keyword analysis, most of those queries are brand queries, which is interesting. Back to the corporate nature of the search, the SERP. And then on your point about conflating ads and organic content with, commercial results, much of the content that's showing up in on the organic portion of the SERP is commercial. These are people who are paying experts, agencies, and others, and themselves trying to pitch a product or service. So there's a lot of commercialization on that page, and so the I don't know what to call it. The pure information is less and less. The information that is untainted by a commercial interest or some sort of self-interested promotion is a diminished part of the overall search result. That may be the kind of intuitive thing that article is reflecting, whether it's ads per se or commercially oriented content. It seems like more and more of the search result is dominated by that kind of stuff.
Thanks for joining David, Mike, and Greg. To stay on top of the latest developments in local, subscribe to our newsletter at nearmedia.co. We'll see you next week.